What if I told you that America's sweetheart, the girl next door with the perfect smile and innocent eyes, was living a completely different life behind closed doors? Sandra Dee, the woman who made millions of hearts flutter in the 1950s and 60s, carried secrets so devastating that they would shock even her most devoted fans. For 30 years, she hid a truth that would have destroyed her career, broken her family, and shattered the illusion of Hollywood's golden girl. But today, we're pulling back the curtain on the double life that Sandra Dee lived, and trust me, by the end of this story, you'll never look at classic Hollywood the same way again. Sandra Dee was born Alexandra Zuck on April 23, 1942, in Bayonne, New Jersey. From the moment she entered this world, fate seemed to have something cruel planned for her. Her childhood wasn't the fairy tale that her movies portrayed. While other girls her age were playing with dolls and dreaming of their futures, young Sandra was already being groomed for a life in the spotlight, but not in the way you'd imagine. Her stepfather, Eugene Duvin, was a man who should have protected her, loved her, and given her the childhood every little girl deserves. Instead, he became her nightmare. Behind the locked doors of their seemingly normal home, Eugene subjected young Sandra to unspeakable abuse that would haunt her for the rest of her life. This wasn't just a one-time incident or a horrible mistake. This was systematic, repeated trauma that began when she was just 5 years old and continued throughout her childhood. Can you imagine being a child and having nowhere to turn? Sandra's mother, Mary, was so focused on transforming her daughter into a star that she either didn't see what was happening or chose to ignore it. Mary was a stage mother in the truest and most terrifying sense of the word. She pushed Sandra into modeling at an incredibly young age, parading her beautiful daughter in front of cameras and advertising executives while the real horror was happening at home. By the age of 12, Sandra was already a successful model, her face appearing in magazines and commercials across the country. But every smile she gave to those cameras was a mask hiding the pain that no child should ever endure. The abuse continued, year after year, and Sandra learned to do what so many survivors do. She compartmentalized her life, creating one version of herself for the world and keeping the broken, hurting girl locked away deep inside. When Sandra was discovered by Hollywood at 14, it seemed like her escape had finally arrived. Universal Studios signed her immediately, and they knew they had something special. They changed her name from Alexandra Zuck to Sandra Dee, a name that sounded innocent, approachable, and perfect for the wholesome roles they had planned for her. Her first major film was Until They Sail in 1957, but it was the reluctant debutante in 1958 that made Hollywood take real notice. Then came Gidget in 1959, and suddenly, Sandra Dee wasn't just a rising star, she was a star. She embodied everything that 1950s America wanted their daughters to be: pretty, polite, innocent, and pure. Teenage girls wanted to be her, and teenage boys wanted to date her. Parents trusted her image completely, never knowing that the girl playing these innocent characters had already experienced more darkness than most people face in a lifetime. But here's where Sandra's double life really began to take shape. In 1960, at just 18 years old, she met Bobby Darin, a singer and actor who was everything Sandra appeared not to be. Bobby was edgy, ambitious, street-smart, and very much aware of the darker sides of life. He was 5 years older than Sandra, and when they met on the set of Come September, the attraction was instant and intense. Bobby saw something in Sandra that others missed. Perhaps he recognized a kindred spirit, someone else who was performing a role in public while dealing with private demons. They fell in love quickly, passionately, and in a way that seemed to promise healing for both of them. They married on December 1, 1960, in a small ceremony in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and the world celebrated the union of two of Hollywood's brightest stars. Their wedding made headlines everywhere, and fans sent thousands of letters congratulating the perfect couple. For a brief moment, Sandra thought she had found her happy ending. In 1961, she gave birth to their son, Dodd Mitchell Darin, and motherhood brought her a joy she had never experienced before. Here was someone she could love unconditionally, someone she could protect from all the horrors she had faced. She threw herself into being a mother with the same intensity she had brought to her acting career, determined that her son would never experience the childhood she had endured. But the trauma of her past wasn't something that a wedding ring or a baby could erase. Sandra had never dealt with the abuse she suffered, never spoken about it, never processed it in any healthy way. She had simply buried it deep and tried to pretend it never happened. But trauma doesn't work like that. It doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. Instead, it festers, growing stronger in the darkness, until it begins to poison everything in your life. This is where Sandra's double life became truly evident to those close to her. To the public, she was still America's sweetheart, appearing in hit after hit including Tammy Tell Me True, Romanov and Juliet, and That Funny Feeling. Her movies consistently performed well at the box office, and her fan mail continued to pour in by the thousands. Magazine covers featured her perfect smile, her beautiful family, and her seemingly ideal life. But behind closed doors, Sandra was falling apart. The coping mechanisms she had developed as a child to deal with her abuse were no longer working. She began to develop severe anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder. She would wash her hands until they bled, unable to feel clean no matter how much she scrubbed. She became terrified of germs to the point where she couldn't function in normal social situations. Leaving her house became increasingly difficult, and eventually, almost impossible. Bobby Darin, despite loving Sandra deeply, didn't understand what was happening to his wife. Remember, this was the early 1960s, a time when mental health issues were heavily stigmatized and rarely discussed openly. Therapy was seen as something for crazy people, and the idea that childhood trauma could manifest as adult mental illness wasn't widely understood or accepted. Bobby grew frustrated with Sandra's increasingly erratic behavior. He was an ambitious performer with a career that demanded travel, public appearances, and constant networking. Sandra's inability to participate in these aspects of his life created a growing divide between them. He couldn't understand why the vibrant, beautiful woman he had married was becoming a recluse who couldn't even attend his concerts or accompany him to important industry events. What Bobby didn't know, what nobody knew, was the full extent of what Sandra was battling every single day. She was fighting not just anxiety and OCD, but also the crushing weight of her secret past. She had never told Bobby about the abuse. She had never told anyone. The shame and guilt that survivors often carry, despite being victims themselves, kept Sandra silent. She believed, as many survivors do, that somehow it had been her fault, that she was damaged goods, that if anyone knew the truth about what had happened to her, they would see her differently. So she kept her secret, even from the man she loved, even as that secret was destroying her from the inside out. By 1967, after 7 years of marriage, Bobby Darin had reached his breaking point. He filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The public was shocked. How could America's perfect couple be splitting up? Tabloids speculated wildly about affairs, about career jealousies, about all sorts of reasons for the divorce, but nobody came close to guessing the truth. Sandra was devastated. She had lost the one person who had made her feel safe, the one relationship that had given her hope that she could have a normal life despite her traumatic past. The divorce was finalized in 1967, and Sandra's world crumbled even further. She had already been struggling with her mental health, but now, with her marriage over and feeling completely alone, she turned to the coping mechanism that would define the next phase of her double life: alcohol. Sandra's drinking started slowly, as it often does. A glass of wine to calm her nerves before a public appearance. A few drinks to help her sleep at night without nightmares. But alcoholism is a progressive disease, and for someone dealing with untreated trauma and mental illness, it's an especially dangerous trap. Within a few years, Sandra was drinking heavily every day. She would show up to film sets drunk or too hungover to work. Her once stellar professional reputation began to crumble. Directors who had once fought to have her in their films now avoided working with her. Studios that had once paid her top dollar now considered her unreliable and difficult. But the public still didn't know the full story. They saw a former star whose career was declining, and they assumed it was simply the natural trajectory of a child star growing up and losing relevance. They had no idea that Sandra was battling demons that had nothing to do with age or changing tastes in Hollywood. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Sandra's double life continued. To the few people who still saw her occasionally, she tried to maintain the facade of the cheerful, optimistic person she had always portrayed. But in private, she was drowning. Her alcoholism worsened, her mental health deteriorated further, and her career effectively ended. She made occasional television appearances, but they were few and far between, and often painful to watch. The vibrant, talented actress who had once lit up the screen was now a shadow of her former self. But still, she kept her secret. Still, she never spoke publicly about the abuse that had started it all, the trauma that had set her on this destructive path. It wasn't until the early 1990s, nearly 30 years after she first became famous, that Sandra finally began to speak about what had happened to her. In her son Dodd's autobiography, she finally revealed the truth about her stepfather's abuse. She admitted to the years of sexual abuse she had endured as a child, the trauma that had shaped every aspect of her life, the secret she had carried for decades while the world saw only the perfect image she presented. The revelation was shocking, heartbreaking, and for many of her fans, it finally made sense of the trajectory her life had taken. This wasn't a story of a spoiled star who couldn't handle fame. This was a story of a survivor who had been fighting her entire life just to keep her head above water. Sandra also opened up about her struggles with alcoholism, her battles with anxiety and OCD, and the eating disorder she had developed as another form of control in a life that had felt so out of control since childhood. She spoke about how anorexia had given her a sense of power over her own body in a way she never had as a child when her body had been violated by someone who should have protected her. These revelations painted a completely different picture of Sandra Dee's life. The double life she had lived wasn't one of glamorous secrets or exciting hidden adventures. It was a life split between the persona she showed the world and the pain she endured in private, a life spent pretending to be okay while slowly dying inside. Bobby Darin, tragically, never lived to hear Sandra's full story. He died in 1973 at just 37 years old from complications following heart surgery. After his death, Sandra admitted that she had never stopped loving him, and many close to her believe that his death deepened her descent into alcoholism. She had lost her chance to explain to him why she had been the way she was, to tell him about the abuse and help him understand that her behavior during their marriage hadn't been about not loving him, it had been about not knowing how to love herself. Sandra spent her final years living quietly in Thousand Oaks, California, still struggling with her addictions and health problems. She developed throat cancer, likely related to her years of heavy smoking and drinking. She also suffered from kidney disease. On February 20, 2005, Sandra Dee died at the age of 62 from complications related to kidney disease. Her death marked the end of a life that had been, in many ways, a tragedy despite all the fame and success. She had lived those 30 years of double life, showing the world a perfect image while suffering in silence, and by the time she finally told her truth, it was almost too late. Sandra's story is important for so many reasons beyond just Hollywood gossip or celebrity tragedy. Her life illustrates the devastating long-term effects of childhood sexual abuse and how trauma, when left untreated, can destroy a person from the inside out. It shows how the pressure to maintain a perfect public image can prevent people from seeking the help they desperately need. It demonstrates how mental illness, addiction, and trauma are interconnected in complex ways that require understanding and compassion, not judgment. Sandra Dee's double life wasn't one she chose out of excitement or rebellion. It was one forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control, by a society that wasn't ready to hear or help survivors of abuse, by a Hollywood system that valued image over authenticity, and by her own understandable fear that the truth would destroy everything she had worked for. In the years since her death, Sandra's story has helped countless survivors of abuse find their voices. Her son, Dodd, has worked to preserve her memory while also being honest about her struggles, helping to destigmatize conversations about trauma and mental health. The revelation of Sandra's double life, the contrast between the innocent, wholesome image she projected and the painful reality she endured, has become a powerful reminder that we never truly know what someone else is going through, no matter how perfect their life might appear from the outside. It's a lesson that remains incredibly relevant today, in an age of social media where everyone presents their highlight reel while hiding their struggles. Sandra Dee's legacy is complicated, as are most legacies of those who lived with significant trauma. She was undeniably talented, breathtakingly beautiful, and incredibly successful by conventional Hollywood standards. But she was also deeply wounded, struggling every day just to survive, living a double life out of necessity rather than choice. Her story isn't just about a fallen star or a tragic Hollywood tale. It's about the real cost of childhood abuse, the importance of mental health care, and the courage it takes to finally tell the truth, even when that truth is painful and reveals that the life everyone thought they knew was really just a carefully maintained illusion. For 30 years, Sandra Dee kept her secret, lived her double life, and suffered in silence. When she finally spoke, it was too late to save her own life, but perhaps not too late to help others understand that behind every perfect image, there might be a person fighting battles we can't see, carrying secrets we can't imagine, and desperately needing compassion rather than judgment.